about Castoriadis' work vis-a-vis the work of Judith Butler. Given that Castoriadis and Butler are critics of a simplistic liberalism that sees rights as instrumental tools and political subjects as just a waiting representation, both of them show us how inequalities and injustices in the realm of gender are effects of power, or the effects of political activity, or shaped, we could say, by particular social imaginary significations. If we take Butler's contribution to feminist theory to be one that sees gender as the effect of power, and that power has effects that go unnoticed because of the power of normalization, that is, heterosexism masks itself as normalcy, not as power, in the context of seeing same-sex relationships as deviant. We can see this in her works Gender Trouble, also in her book Bodies That Matter. Then we can see her contribution to gender theory as a critical one, to identify and reveal hidden aspects of power and privilege that are not easily transformed. However, despite her work in the psychic life of power to think through how we come to internalize degrading images and visions of ourselves that harm our prospects for freedom, she remains stronger as an ethical thinker than a political one. Certainly ethics and politics are tied together. But I mean that her work isn't richly political in the sense of offering a complicated picture of individual agency or of collective struggle. I think her work is in the ethical register of figuring out how to humanize others, such as her recent work in Precarious Life. What Castoriadis offers that I find more productive and a better way to make sense of both the constraints of power and desire in the form of social instituted imaginaries and the ways in which individually and collectively these can be broken is his interest in how something new comes to be in democratic life. Of course, democratic life is not so much in evidence when decisions about our lives are made elsewhere. However, Castoriadis continually returns to the importance of forging individuals able to do otherwise than repeat the same. This is the case both in the practice of psychoanalysis and in the practice of politics as democratic politics. Both require an interaction with others where both parties are at risk and may or should change. This is true for how he thinks of the relationship between the analyst and the analysand, and it is true of the practice of democracy. If this isn't the case, we are not engaged in the practice of autonomy, which must entail the political dimension of transformative action and the philosophical dimension of transformative self-reflection. I suppose this is why Castoriadis often quotes a note from Freud, when Freud said that there were three impossible professions: psychoanalysis, politics, and pedagogy. Not just hard, but impossible. Impossible because the subject matter here is the human being who can't simply be directed to change. To the third question, how to think about the feminist movement as an expression of autonomy given all of the challenges of heteronomy that we see. I think that it's right to see diverse feminist movements as expressions of autonomy, given the most general feminist goal of seeking the conditions for freedom for women, however that is defined in time and place. At the same time, I think we should keep in mind with Castoriadis the ongoing open nature of the human condition. For this reason, we can see what one could call a dialectic that goes both ways. On the one hand, towards greater autonomy, on the other, towards heteronomy, as a social historical fact. In this regard, Castoriadis is similar to Arendt, who also knew that novelty in history is not simply a positive thing for the human condition. We can produce the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as the Gulag and the Guantanamo Bay detention facility. Obviously, Castoriadis has never been a liberal defender of autonomy, such as John Stuart Mill or Immanuel Kant or other liberals who viewed autonomy as only a progressive movement in the history of free republics. What's so interesting about Castoriadis' work on autonomy is that there is this dialectical movement or tension between autonomy and heteronomy, but it is directionless in the sense of being without a natural telos. that it is again up to political activity of individuals in collective action to have some consciousness or self-reflection about the direction that is better, i.e. more autonomous than not, to decide what is good or bad. And this evaluation can change, and we can be wrong. That's a risk in political life, and is part of the tragic part of politics, which I think Castoriadis rightly emphasizes throughout his writing. The other way to talk about this is Castoriadis' vision of the imagination as creation ex nihilo. I find this a rather unfortunate phrase because it can seem as if creation is a romantic spark of genius or literally something out of nothing. And there has been interesting work on this idea by Castoriadis scholars in a philosophical register such as Susie Adams. But I think what is so fascinating is the way in which, for example, there is novelty in human history that can't be fully explained rationally or logically. We can see this in the ideal of women's rights or in the terrible creation of death camps in the Nazi era, for which there is no precedent and no ultimate cause. And yet we must still take account and judge these formations as just or unjust. Autonomy, then, is both a practice and a critical tool for interpretation, and judgment. That is, I think it's a valuable contribution to social theory to try to formulate autonomy in the face of heteronomy as an ongoing process. This is a practice in which we engage in psychoanalysis. We don't want to keep repeating bad patterns of behavior or repeat a traumatic harm if we want to pull ourselves together in ways in which we can enact some sort of freedom as action without a rule, but not just in any old way whatsoever. But this is admittedly one of the challenging parts of Castoriadis' social theory, how to understand the radical part of the imagination as creation. To come to the last question, it's a rather long question, the gist of which is how to think with Castoriadis in terms of human rights, democracy, and the important criticism of colonial imposition or cultural imperialism. If I understand the debate correctly, in terms of metaphysics and post-metaphysics, and the charge of cultural imposition or imperialism, here's what I think it is. What we can see in debates about the foundations of human rights along the liberal thread of argument is that if we can no longer assume the metaphysical nature of rights, that rights are simply out there as natural rights or as the gift of divine law without cultural and historical mediation, then we can defend a post-metaphysical foundation of rights through which we may be able to achieve what John Rawls calls an overlapping consensus on basic rights claims across cultures, or what Jürgen Habermas would refer to as politically agreed upon rights claims, sufficient for deliberation about how to defend them. Of course, even with these versions of political liberalism, there is a justified critique of cultural imposition. After all, we've seen the ways in which the Bush administration and others have used the call to protect women's rights as one justification for the U.S. war in Afghanistan. But even among thoughtful liberals who worry about cultural imposition, such as Martha Nussbaum and Sheila Ben-Habib, there is still an unspoken or unacknowledged assumption of the goodness and the rightness of human rights as the defense of individual dignity and freedom from harm, which is very much coded within Western values of the individual in his or her life. These are thoughtful feminist thinkers well aware of the dangers of colonial imposition. But as Linda Cirilli has recently argued, with the help of Castoriadis among many other thinkers, Nussbaum and Ben-Habib end up looking for a meta-theoretical universalism that can incorporate rationally the human rights that could, for instance, condemn both honor killings of women and workplace discrimination. However, this leaves aside the political practice of judging without a rule, something that Castoriadis is well able to press us to experience as a practice of autonomy. But this practice of autonomy is not simply about judging harms in the world as unjust. It also requires a willingness on the part of the person judging to rethink his or her position of what autonomy ought to mean. Indeed, if democracy is the regime of self-limitation, and if the practice of this at the individual level requires requires learning these habits, we can see why for Castoriadis the political dangers of heteronomy and of hubris loomed so large. It is risky and difficult to accept self-limitation. Certainly Castoriadis rarely mentions human rights in any detail, although he does refer to human rights as an example of such self-limitation. I think, however, that it is productive for us to see human rights as social imaginary signification. It's commonplace to see human rights language as proliferating and having legitimacy globally. However, to think of human rights as social imaginary significations means that we still have to do the political work of translating and debating what those rights mean. This is democratic work and the work of societies or nodes of societies that operate regionally or transnationally to take the project of autonomy seriously. This means, for instance, that we need to keep in mind a democratic criteria when judging the deployment of women's human rights. Certainly many groups from across the political spectrum will legitimate their actions as those that defend women's human rights. But to avoid cultural imposition doesn't mean abandoning the language of human rights or abandoning the need to make political judgments. But it does mean, ideally, in a politics that I would endorse, a democratic commitment to horizontal encounters where both parties are put at risk to revise their political judgments of what would indeed protect women's rights. In this regard, seeing human rights as a social imaginary provides a terrain on which we can tip in a more heteronomous mode of action or free action, or we can tip to a more autonomous mode of action that requires a more grassroots and cooperative effort to radicalize how human rights could be made realizable. Despite his limitations, which all thinkers of worth have, I still find Castoriadis a relevant and radical thinker for progressive egalitarian politics because of his work on the social imaginary, the radical imagination, and the project of autonomy. I'm so pleased to be able to think about his work with you. As I practice my Spanish, I can understand more of the previous lectures, and I think that this is an excellent and important conversation in which you are engaged, and I am learning a lot. Muchas gracias. And thank you to my camera person and colleague, Dr. Jenny McGarrelin, in the philosophy department, a specialist in environmental, political philosophy, among other things, and technical assistance from Tim Israel. Adios.